Hi everyone. Thought I'd offer you a short Dvar Torah on Parshat VaYetzei. Years ago, when we first moved to Jerusalem, we lived in a more, how shall we say, bohemian part of the city. I know that was perhaps a little bit off the beaten path, because I once asked people what were their profession when I was in synagogue, and whereas in many Jewish communities you'll hear doctors, lawyers, businessmen, things along those lines, high tech, who knows what, I think the number one profession that people had mentioned was a drummer. And a close follow-up, number two, was shepherd. How exactly you could be a shepherd in the middle of Jerusalem, I'm not sure, but that's what people suggested that they were engaged in as their business activity. The truth is, being a shepherd is actually quite Jewish. If you think about it, many of our greatest leaders are shepherds, were shepherds. Abraham is a shepherd, and we can learn a tremendous amount from him. Sort of the going from place to place, leading the sheep, is symbolic of his spiritual journey, that he was able to grow from place to place, in contrast to Lot, his nephew, who remains static in one place in Sodom and Gomorrah, and not just static physically, but also it's symbolic, I think, of being static and not moving spiritually. And then, of course, there's Moshe. Moshe, we're introduced to him as being one of the greatest shepherds of all time, not just a shepherd of a people, but he learned his skills as being a shepherd of actual sheep. And the story goes that he merited it to meet the burning bush and really have an experience with God because he was shepherding his flock, and one small sheep got away, and he went looking for that one sheep. There was no sheep that was not important, and he went and found that lost sheep, and then he comes in contact with the burning bush. Of course, there's a lot of, I think, beautiful, deep lessons in that very often when we show our concern for the small, the weak, that's very often when we actually have the opportunity to encounter God. And then David Hamelech, David the king. The Midrash tells us that the reason why God falls so in love with David in the very first instance is because of his shepherding ability. The Midrash says that when he would shepherd his flock, he would always have the young sheep go first and eat the more tender grass, and then he would follow it up with the older sheep who were able to handle the tougher grass that would remain after the younger sheep first had their feed. And God saw this and David's ability to realize that different sheep have different needs, and realize that this person will be a good leader if he can transfer those skills to leading people as well. And all this, of course, leads us to this week's Torah portion, because Yaakov is also a shepherd. At first glance, it's hard to learn what lessons, or see what lessons we can learn from Yaakov's shepherding, right? We know that he is willing to accept his payment in sheep, and he starts off with black sheep, but then there's a lot of mutations that take place along the way, and then they're speckled, and then they're spotted, and then they're striped. He has an entirely sort of a motley crew of a flock. And what are we supposed to learn from that? That this, as he goes through life with this sheep that is so odd, so to speak. So Rabbi Mordechai Kamenetsky has, I think, a beautiful point on this matter. He says that most shepherds would be aghast at having such odd-looking flock of sheep, but not so Yaakov. That Yaakov saw the diversity of his sheep, the mutations of his sheep, and actually saw something quite beautiful within it. And he actually saw that each of these individual sheep added to the not just the diversity, but the strength of his flock. And indeed, the Torah teaches us that his flock was very, very successful. It grew and grew and grew. And of course, there is scientific evidence to support that when you have a diversity, you don't actually weaken necessarily a flock, but you actually can strengthen. And of course, it's not just sheep we're talking about, but I would suggest also that we're talking about human beings. And Yaakov is the first perfect example of that, because Yaakov takes his appreciation of diversity from the world of shepherding sheep to the world of shepherding his family. And his family, of course, is the foundation of the Jewish people. It's interesting to note, our 12 tribes emanate from his 12 sons, and each of his sons is totally different. Yosef is a dreamer. Yehuda represents royalty. Levi is a teacher. Then you have those that go into business and are always sailing the seas, looking for new opportunities there. And then there's others that sit and remain in the tents learning Torah all day long. Yaakov does not view these differences as something that weakens his family, but in fact he celebrates it. He realizes that each one of these sons brings something new to the table, something different to the table, and collectively it strengthens the entire family. He doesn't want everyone to be the exact same. In fact, that would weaken. We see this in agriculture as well. Very often monocultures when it comes to raising different crops. This is happening in the modern world a lot these days. That in order to be successful financially, whole farms will be just with one crop. But of course, then if a disease comes along, it wipes out the entire crop. That's, of course, the story of the potato famine. Whereas if you have many different types of things growing, they actually very often can feed off one another and survive if, God forbid, there's a danger. So Yaakov sees this value in his family as well, that each of the children, each of the sons brings something valuable and meaningful. And in that diversity, they're actually able to unify with a common purpose and become much stronger as a result of that. And I think that's the lesson we learn from Yaakov's odd sheep in this week's Parsha, that the diversity of those sheep actually is a strength, just as it is with the Jewish people as well. Have a Shabbat Shalom.